Welcome, everybody, and apologies for the late start, but we're delighted now to have with us a delegation representing the leadership of the Libe and STOA committees of the European Parliament. I'm Fran Burwell, and I want to welcome you all today on a day that looks like Brussels has brought its weather to us, unfortunately. I also want to extend a special shout out to the European Parliament Liaison Office for helping us organize this event today. And particularly this session that is focused on the Parliament. The Libe Committee, as most of you know, is the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, and it has been one of the primary voices working on issues of privacy and the internet for quite some time now. The STOA Committee is, I think, less well known. It is the Science and Technology Options Assessment Panel, and it is charged with providing the Parliament with independent studies on science and tech issues surrounding the Parliament's work. Among its priorities this year is the potential and challenges of the internet. It's, I think, an excellent time to have this discussion, and the session that will follow after this one, in which we will present our report on a transatlantic digital agenda, because it brings together issues that are all too often discussed separately. In particular, privacy. In particular, I want to focus a little bit on privacy here. The Libe Committee has played a central role in the design and passage of the General Data Protection Regulation. This is a very important update of the privacy framework in the EU that affects many of the companies and, of course, any individual who travels to Europe as well. The Libe Committee has also been key in the passage of the European Passenger Name Records legislation. And I think that following the attacks in Paris and Brussels, we have all felt the pressure of trying to reconcile security and privacy, particularly as it became clear how limited the sharing of information was about suspected terrorists across borders in Europe. And these are issues that we have dealt with as well. And I think that there is now a clear need of our societies to think about balancing privacy and security instead of seeing them in two different environments. And I would say that we have struggled with this as well. You can see us going from the Patriot Act to the Freedom Act and still ongoing discussions. There's also another discussion that is about not only the challenges but the economic opportunities of the digital space. I understand big data is one of STOA's priorities in looking at the challenges and opportunities of the internet. And we've just seen now how difficult it is to reconcile privacy and the digital economy as we've watched this kind of rocky transition from safe harbor to privacy shield. But it is the digital economy that is bringing innovation and growth in both the US and European worlds. Indeed, we really shouldn't talk about the digital economy because it's throughout our entire economies. Even traditional firms such as automobile companies and manufacturing companies are all becoming digitized. And it was because of this transition, this transatlantic digital space, and the great opportunity, but also the fact that over the past few years it has presented some of the most vexing issues in US-EU relations, that we launched our task force last year, which has produced the report we're releasing today. And I wanted to take a moment right now to acknowledge the leadership and work of Ambassador William Kennard, who many of you know both in Washington and in Brussels as our former ambassador to the EU. And I know Bill wanted to say just a few comments before we start.
Thank you. Thank you, Fran, and thank you all for joining us today. It's really a happy coincidence that on the day we're releasing this report, we have a visit from the Libe delegation and the STOA delegation. This is really a wonderful happenstance for us because, as you know, when you write a report like this, your goal is to get important policymakers to focus on it and read it, and they're here today. So make sure you get a copy on your way out. And I also wanted just to take a very brief opportunity to welcome you to Washington. Many of the folks here from the Parliament were so warm in welcoming me to Brussels and making my time there so enjoyable and productive, and I just wanted to return the favor and welcome you here to my home city. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill, and we'll hear more from Bill in the next session. But now, I wanted to move on and quickly introduce the panel. I'm not going to do long introductions. We have, as our first speaker, Claude Moraes, chair of the Libe Committee from the S&D Group and the UK. And we have Jan-Philipp Albrecht, vice chair of Libe and from the Greens, also rapporteur for the entire parliament for the GDPR. And Paul Rubig, chair of the STOA group, EPP from Austria, and Eva Kali, first vice chair of STOA from S&D. She's from Greece, and while Paul Rubig has been very active, particularly on the SME side, I understand, Ms. Kali has been very active on issues of innovation, cybersecurity, and big data. So we are now going to speak for no more than 5 minutes each, and preferably a bit less. But Mr. Murray, Chairman Murray, the floor is yours.
I don't know why you're giving all the time limits so.
Because you told me to.
Yeah, well, okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Bill Kennard, we really miss him, and he showed with the sort of brevity of what he said, just the sort of class that we miss, you know. And I think it was also that he came at a very pivotal time when many of the issues which are now coming to completion were anything but complete at the time. I think you probably remember PNR, which Timothy Kirkhope, who's at the back, we were more or less struggling with. And I do want to introduce, as well as the 4 colleagues who are here from Libe and STOA, we have other members of the European Parliament, Joe Weidenholzer, Axel Voss, and Ana Gomez with us. That's probably more MEPs than you've ever had in a room for a while. And we're here for a reason, I promise within the 5 minutes. And that is that it is a momentous time for digital and data protection and trying to get the balance right between privacy and security, something which we discussed many times. I know the purists don't like to talk about balance between these two things, but in the real world, that's what they talk about. And the data protection regulation, which Jan will speak about in more detail in a moment, is a huge achievement, but a huge achievement for us that we also had the data protection directive, the security directive that could happen alongside it, which for us encapsulated our ability to get the balance right. And also that PNR came through with what I believe are the safeguards required, but at a pivotal time again in terms of security. But in terms of transatlantic digital commerce, nobody should be in any doubt, and you hear it from STOA colleagues today, that we take this extremely seriously as part of our job. There is no narrative, as sometimes I've heard, that we tilt too much towards privacy. No, privacy for us is about consumer confidence. Without consumer confidence, we have no proper commerce. And I think you rightly said that the digital economy is the economy. So if we don't get the successor to Safe Harbor right, we are in trouble. So the question of the privacy shield is something that we take deadly seriously. And to get it right means that we go through our procedures, and we do it for a reason. The Article 29 Working Party has made it very clear that there are both commercial and public authority concerns which we need to get right. So we'll go through those procedures, but we're confident that we're going through the right levels of accountability to ensure that successor to Safe Harbor is one that can inspire confidence in the commercial world as well as for consumers. That is what we're aiming for. And it has to be underpinned by the General Data Protection Regulation, which was the great achievement of the Parliament this year. And it may have to be rewritten in terms of that legislation. So this is about a relationship of consumer confidence, something that flows well. But if we don't get the legislation right, then it will not last the test of time. It will be challenged in the courts, and it will fall because it simply isn't good enough. And I want to say something about STOA. Eva and Paul are here. We make a huge effort in Libe to ensure that we understand that technology is part of this package, and that we, as politicians, don't always understand technology. Just to finish on this point, I spoke to a politician from Singapore who said the problem with Western politicians, that's you and us, American and European, is that you don't know anything about technology. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you know, in Singapore, you know, we've got Wi-Fi in all our trains, and we've got this and we've got that. It's because we're all scientists and we kind of know what we're doing. And suddenly I looked, it's probably apart from Eva, who's got PhDs and everything, but I suddenly looked at the list of where everyone comes from, apart from Jan, who's an information lawyer. And there are lots of lawyers. Sorry, Bill. Lots of business people, lots of former teachers, not that many scientists. It is absolutely critical we get this right. But the message I want to send out today is we want to get the balance right, but we are taking this very seriously, and we want to get the political balance right. That way we will have good legislation, and we will be fit for the future in this extraordinary new context between privacy and security. And I'll leave it there. And no doubt we'll have more in-depth analysis of that from Jan, my colleague Jan Albrecht.
And Philip, thank you very much. And Philip?
Thank you, and thanks also for the opportunity to speak. No worries, we are used to be concise. In plenary of the European Parliament, we sometimes only speak 1 minute and have to still bring across the point we want to make. So I would like to follow up just where Claude finished. We are having done already quite significant progress in getting legislative, regulatory answers to the challenges and opportunities with regard to digitization of all parts of our life. I think that the finalization of the data protection privacy framework in the European Union is a huge step forward towards not only a European answer to these questions, but also towards the opportunities building transatlantic and global standards and answers to this. And I think that we need to move on to that. We have made significant progress in the field of information exchange in law enforcement sector, for example, with the umbrella agreement. And I think that's really something where we have to show that this is like it's possible to do things together if we want so to bring standards and bring common standards across also the Atlantic. And but what's important in these times is to not stop there, but to look ahead, to do more, because we are, I think, only catching up in several things when it comes to technology evolving, when it comes to globalization of our markets. I mean, borders will be, at least by consumer behavior, more invisible in the future, and we need to cross that. Of course, if politics can follow up to that, at the moment can be a bit doubted, or it's a challenge to see that we may be may be equipped to do further answers already in 1 or 2 years when there have been significant decisions, referendums or elections here or in Germany and France. We have to see that we are still capable to give common answers, but I think that we until now have taken significant progress. And it's important to see that now, as the European Union has really finalized the general data protection regulation and set its standard for the European market, we need to embrace that as a chance, because it's not that this is creating more uncertainty. It's exactly the opposite of that. Of course, we need to get all used to new rules. If you try to harmonize 28 different standards to one, you can't expect everything looking the same afterwards. Especially in Europe, you need to understand you can't think that it's looking like it is looking in your own member state afterwards. So it's always something we need to learn. It's a compromise we are doing, but I think it's a huge it's a huge chance, especially for companies on the digital market. It's a huge chance because if you embrace the new like regulatory answers, like for example, privacy by design, privacy by default, the data portability rights of consumers, creating more competition, more like level playing field also for different competitors who may even in the future now really have the opportunity on building on privacy as a competitive advantage on a global digital market. I think that's a real chance for companies all over across the global digital market. It's a real chance for the upcoming development of big data technologies to see how can we do not only like big data technologies, but also smart data or secure data technologies, which really build trust for consumers who are aware of the challenges out there, because they are aware of the fact that they might at a certain moment be perhaps discriminated because of certain information being used in certain contexts again. So we need to incorporate that directly. And I think that with our first step forward on regulation in a digitalized environment, we serve also as a toolkit for companies who may use that as a chance. And of course, we also serve, I wouldn't say as a blueprint, but as an inspiring answer for regulators. And I still think that although, of course, we don't know what happens after November, and we have to live with what's upcoming, but I still think that we need to work consistently also on consumer privacy on both sides of the Atlantic and build two fundamentals for a solid bridge for data transfers. I think that the Privacy Shield may make things better, yes, but it can't be the final answer to our common sphere and to our common environment for consumer privacy in particular. I think we need to go on persistently working on it. And I also think that we are here not only to like convey messages, but also to be part of that progress and process, to contribute and inspire a little about our views and our thoughts, which we have made up throughout the last years intensively, I can say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have some good questions for both of you on Privacy Shield and the GDPR when we can turn to the audience. So, Mr. Ruppig, the floor is yours.
Yes, you know, in Brussels I got a nickname, and my nickname is Roaming Paul, because I was first rapporteur on the roaming bill. Yeah. And, you know, roaming is making calls cross-border in 28 member states. Rapporteur. Yes, and, you know, getting rid of the incumbents and giving a chance to new entrants is at least my story on SMEs, to give SMEs a chance to be part of the digital single market. And, of course, we started with phone calls, with the SMS, and at this time data roaming was not so important than today. But today we have a total shift into data roaming, and now we had the fourth edition of the roaming directive. And I think it's quite important that next year we will skip roaming, and that makes it possible within the 28 member states to have the same pricing than in your home member state. And if you see that we get close to the 5G network, where the data upload would be much more efficient, and if we get fiber connection to our masts, it will be a big progress to have big data really in the possibility for everyone. So, of course, the ownership of data will be a big question, which we have to solve. We see that the identification through your device is very developed now. because with your device you can have at any time a voice detection, so you can find out that I'm from Austria and that I'm from Upper Austria and that my city is Wales and this dialect is quite well known. So you can detect by voice detection. It's much better than any passport. And of course you can put the camera at any time to analyze a face detection, or if you have a good camera you can make an eye scan, you can make a head scan. So with your device you can be identified 100%. And it doesn't make any change if you change your SIM card or your IMI. It's the data which is behind which can detect you in a very nice way. That was the reason why the Libe committee asked us in STOA to check the technical possibilities which NSA is using. So what is behind the technologies which could be used by NSA and all the other services in the world, and how are the technical options which they can use to get into the ownership of data. And we made a very thick report which we not put on the front page of European Parliament's homepage. But if you dig far enough, it's public and everybody can look into it. And it's very clear that we now have to find out how we can get the privacy done in the right way. And on the other hand, we are politicians. Transparency will play a very important role. So how can we get these two pillars, privacy and transparency, into a nice match? And you know, that's a real hard game, because insisting on privacy, no problem, it's data protection. Asking for having transparency is a clear question of compliance. So you can be in both pillars very good. But the truth is between the two pillars. What is the definition between these two pillars? And so STOA is very much insisting on cybersecurity. So we are looking very much into the details of encryption, which new encryptions are possible, starting from blockchain technology, with all the cyber currencies and all the options which are coming out with these new technologies. We look into a lot of other areas, like quantum technology, to see what opportunities we get through quantum technologies and quantum computing. And STOA is really making a lot of meetings and debates on which options are available for the future. So we don't do any decision making. We want to help our colleagues from the committees to show them the options, to see in the foresight debate from the technological options what are the social, the economic, the cultural impacts of different technologies. And then we have the so-called silo and pipe strategy, where we look on the science matrix of communication, so that we can measure between our knowledge silos. All committees are excellent knowledge silos, keep their knowledge quite nicely in their influence. And we want to measure how is the communication between these silos, and not to find out where the communication is excellent. I think we want to find out where communication is missing. And I think that's very important in the transatlantic relations, that we look into our silos and where can we get benefit out of the relation. And if it's TTIP or a lot of other things, if we look to, and you brought it very good to the point, to the standards. Yes, we will need standards for the 5G technology. If we don't develop global standards, we can't communicate in a very efficient way. And that's where we are looking forward. How can we develop a framework? I would say for the next generation. It's 2050, we will be 10 billion people in this world. What does it mean to have today the right framework and to look to the options from the technological point of view? So it's very interesting to see that this development is on both sides of the Atlantic in a kind of revolution. We are now in a time where the real world is mirrored in the virtual world. And now we have to learn how to act within the virtual world, and which structures we have to build from all the algorithm, how to use it, and how to transfer this virtual world again back into the real world.
Thank you very much. And as our final contributor, Ms. Kai?
Also, I would like to add some things that are more political because I think everybody here knows how things work. So we are 28 different member states, but not like the states here because we have different languages, different mentalities, different taxation systems. So it's very difficult because we're not really one market. We're trying to work on that. Roaming and Paul is really helping us because we had different charges if you travel across Europe. So for us, everything, communication made everything difficult. So now it's going to be really helpful for everyone to cross-border work, and we try to do the same in different levels. So it's one of us. We're so many members. Each one is working to an important file. So we happen to be these committees that we asked for these delegations, but everyone here has a strong report. So we're trying to work in a deeper union. So for example, I've been working with a taxation report, basically. So if you are an SME and want to apply to the European market, you cannot do it unless you know each different taxation system, different languages, different legislation. So it's a bit impossible. So you can export to China or US, but difficult in Europe because you have to have 28 different knowledge of how the system works. So we're trying to work on that. So legislation is really important. I can just point out because Science and Technology, STOA, we have an amazing secretariat, scientists that work for us and with us to try to have a strategy for the future, because if we don't do the proper legislation and if we don't work with our stronger allies like US to prepare the legislation in common, so common standards, as you very well said, then imagine if we have a patient traveling around, he's so restricted that he cannot have his prescription here because nothing is really working through the internet yet because data protection problems, they don't trust the system. So if somebody has a problem here, he cannot understand the language, he doesn't have everything with him, he's historic, so he cannot be treated. So we're trying to figure all these things out to have it, to work out with that. We say that like in 2030, in like 15 years, 80% of all the jobs will acquire digital skills. We haven't done that yet. So I know UK, and that's why you should stay in Europe. UK is the first country in Europe. Like, please stay. So anyway. But I realized that like in UK, they already have like, when you're like a child, you go to school and you learn math, philosophy, language, grammar. You learn coding in UK. Well, not in our schools. I'm from Greece. So if you learn coding, then for you it's like another language that you can take advantage of in anything, lawyer, scientist, doctor, everything. Because we don't just have to train children and patients, we have to train the doctors and the nurses, so we have to train everyone. So we have a difficult task there, and this is why we're basically here, to try to exchange best practices, or like to underline the problems that we face and to explain why we should like work together. And also, as you very well said, data protection. We don't exchange information. The attacks in Brussels and Paris, instead of making us exchange information, we really close the borders. We try to block, with our own services, secret services, and they don't exchange information. If they did, maybe we wouldn't have the second round of attacks. So I think we should at least try to achieve a platform and have like a discussion on a basic exchange of specific information. So I think it's very important to keep bridging the gaps that we have, maybe, and try to foresee the future. And this is exactly what our department is for, is like for the foresight unit of the European Parliament. So I do hope we can manage to establish this relationship together. And just like somebody said, because I said we should have like a table of discussing things more often, we have the problem of migration. US is far. They don't they can have stricter control, but there are problems that are made by decisions that we took years ago, and we have to face it. But we have to face it together because, as you saw, like you discussed today, I think about Zika, like an epidemic doesn't have borders. Like the crisis of 2008 didn't face borders, so we have to have common answers to that. And I think we have to stay to the table of the dialogue and continue working on that, because they say if you're not on the table, you're basically in the menu. So we don't want that.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. I'm going to open this discussion to the floor, and I think we have some microphones somewhere, so put up your hands if you have a question, and we'll start with this gentleman right here. But I wanted to just draw out what you said about the balance between security and privacy, and how one of the goals of this delegation right now is to start a conversation about that. But also, Jan Philip Albrecht, the idea of global standards, of taking what we have started to build in the transatlantic space and easing it into the global arena, but yet at the same time, the GDPR has been criticized very much for lack of a genuine one-stop shop, and also the fines, of course, associated with it. So it's not an uncontroversial document itself. But I also wanted to just recognize the great contribution that I'm learning about of STOA. One of our recommendations was to boost the scientific expertise and technical expertise of legislators who deal with these issues. And it's great to see progress in the European Parliament. Now we can talk about Congress. And I think your point about training is really crucial, because we have so many people who are, I think, scared of rather than engaged with the internet, and not quite clear about what it means to them. And so I think this is a big difference between my generation and the generation that comes after, who grew up with it. But I think also it is something that in certain countries, certainly in Europe, but I think certain areas here, there is much more fear about the cloud, for example, than there is the willingness to use its advantages. So let me bring in this gentleman, and we'll have some questions. Go right ahead.
Hi,
Please identify yourself.
Yes, Jack Capperell with Inside U.S. Trade. And I have a question about the Privacy Shield. So in April, the Article 29 Working Party released its report. They cited a number of deficiencies that the Commission should address before they make the final adequacy determination. They touched on topics such as data retention, mass and indiscriminate surveillance, and the independence of the U.S. Ombudsperson. And the Commission responded by saying they would address those issues, but it seems as though, especially the latter two, deal with the U.S. side of the agreement. And so I was wondering if you can maybe share some insight as to how exactly the Commission intends to address those issues, especially because it doesn't seem as though they can do that unilaterally.
I can start, and then I can maybe, Jan can go into more depth. I mean, first of all, it's a very political issue. These agreements and legislation are all political. We are a parliament with different political views, and different colleagues will have different views. Although listening to Eva talking about 28 different member states, and you're this cohesive whole, you know, if we are dysfunctional, then I don't know what Congress is. But I mean, honestly, just having a look at that. Sorry, if there's any Congress people here. I do recall also talking about judicial redress. You have one conversation with Bill Kennard, which is completely cohesive, indeed respectful and structured, and then you come to Congress and people were talking about foreigners and we're not giving you this and that. I mean, it's very tough, but that's democracy. As Churchill said, you know, it's the worst form of government except for everything else that's tried. So the agreements, first of all, the agreement structure is slightly strange, and we're going to have this Article 31 member states involved to give it a final okay or not. And the Article 29 Working Party is part of our structures, and they've clearly said that on the data retention point and other points, there are real concerns. And that is reflected amongst MEPs. There's a spectrum of views amongst MEPs. I mean, I'm certainly concerned. I think the Article 29 Working Party, on each of the points that you mentioned, underline the concerns about Privacy Shield. So it has to be fixed. Otherwise, we're going to go into a situation, in my view, and this is my view, where following Safe Harbour and all the problems with Safe Harbour, the replacement will be seen on one level as acceptable, and you're going to have this parallel universe, and then all the problems of data retention and all the other problems pointed out by the Article 29 Working Party, which exists. Now, unless we fix this, we're not going to be in a situation where we can move forward on something so important. So that's my view, and so we're in a very critical phase. But my view is we have to be very transparent about it, very open about what the problems are, calibrate the extent of the problems. Members, when we've been here, and they often say delegations are not very useful, but members, while they've been here, have been asking about Privacy Shield to calibrate amongst the interlocutors that we've been talking to, amongst all of you, exactly what you think about Privacy Shields, whether it's the Federal Trade Commission or others. You know, do you think that do you agree with the problems pointed out by the Article 29 Working Party? What's your perspective on it? And we need to understand that from the business community as well. We had a hearing with the business community present, so there are concerns. But as I say, my other colleagues may have slightly different views. But I get to be chair, so I could get to say that. Sorry, I'm normally self-effacing, but you know, we need to fix these things, otherwise we're going to have the same mess. And it's just too big to have the same situation with the agreement. So we've got this passage now in the next few months, and we need to deal with that. That's partly why we're here. Can I just say one really quick point? I know I'm just this other point about this narrative that runs about privacy and security. And again, you know, Eva talking about the 28 member states, and I want to pick up on this because she mentions it because there is this narrative running. Earlier today, we had the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security, an extraordinary point made by them. Experts, you know, we had about 7 or 8 of the key officials there, saying that Europol, their cooperation with Europol was at such a level that they had, 10 or 11 officials embedded with Europol. Europol's not that big. Yeah. And the amount of passage of information between Europol and the United States at the highest point of terrorist activity or alleged terrorist activity was extraordinary. Now, Europol's not that big an agency, but it's highly effective and highly respected. Other member states have their own intelligence activity. It's not a shared competence. So it's just very important. I just want to make that point because I think there is a narrative running that somehow, you know, we're dysfunctional, we do all our own things. When it comes to those agencies which are European, there's really effective cooperation with the United States. And of course, Europol has been strengthened this year, but with some privacy safeguards, of course.
So, thank you. Do you want to add anything? And one way I would finesse this or add to this is I've sometimes heard that there are 2 ways forward with Privacy Shield. One is it has to be perfect or it's not acceptable. And the other one is you go forward and you try and evolve it, but you have then less leverage on the Americans because you are continuing to move it forward. So, I mean, do you see, can we work on this? Can we build the ship while we're sailing in order to keep international transatlantic commerce going? Or does it have to be perfect before it actually can be launched?
The question depends on what's perfect and is perfect like what the European Court of Justice requires, or is perfect what we want to achieve as politicians as a standard. Because most important message on the Privacy Shield, first of all, is it's not an agreement. It's an implementation decision by the European Commission, one-sided, to decide if a third country, non-EU country, is providing for an essentially equivalent protection level so that data can freely flow from the European market to that non-EU country. And the court has lined out some denominators, what this essentially equivalent protection means, especially with regard to judicial redress, also control and oversight in some areas. I think we're working on it. The European Commission is working on it. Also on the whole field of consumer privacy protection, there's still like deficits also. I would like to point that out, not only what the court has said, but also what we've said when Safe Harbor got into place in 2000. There was already back then the criticism that there's no general privacy legislation in place in the US. So I think that we need to somehow respect that the European Union has a court and that this court is not like completely freaked out. It's just reading the laws, you know. So and we have to somehow respect that we should like follow the laws in a way, you know. That means that while I fully agree that we should build the ship while sailing, we need to make sure that we are not like sailing illegally completely. And in order to allow that, let me say that my personal view on this is that we should make sure that we are progressing to build it. And therefore not to allow that something happens like we saw the last 15 years, that at a certain moment a court comes and just says you should have built since 15 years but you didn't do, and now we are destroying your work, you know. So we should not get into that situation once again. So I think that sometimes it helps to like restrict ourselves to say, okay, we have to revisit that question perhaps in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And come back to it in the light of, for example, the data protection regulation in Europe, renewing the scheme there, for example, a new administration perhaps in the US going forward on consumer privacy, or even on governmental oversight on intelligence even, which also is a task for Europeans, by the way, to do, but that's not part of this assessment. But I think we should constantly really urge us and force us both on both sides to come back to that. And I think that's part of what we need to debate, how we do that in this procedure. We don't have a complete say or veto on that as European Parliament, but I think we will have our say on it in the upcoming weeks in a way of a resolution. Let me say just one point also on this privacy and security thingy. I completely agree that the assessment on the European side that we didn't do enough on information sharing is an important one. But I would like to add that this is not the conclusion that information sharing automatically is hampered by privacy. I would even say that the contrary is the case. In Europe, for example, we have had 28 different standards also in information sharing on police and justice authorities. On intelligence, we have no common laws at all, you know. So maybe that hampers security more. So I would say that common data protection and privacy provisions sometimes can be even helpful to allow for better information sharing and therefore for better security. And we should think about that perspective too. And just one sentence on the question of the GDPR critiques. I mean, it's completely clear no law, even by the best democracy, will deliver for perfect answers. There will always be criticism, legitimate criticism. On these 2 points, I would say I would still be from a different view, because look about the current situation in Europe. There is no real one-stop shop. You have 28 different authorities working like in different capacities of how they think things should be enforced. You have an Irish data commissioner, or coming from my region, Schleswig-Holstein, a data commissioner having completely different views on how enforcement should go. Also, by the way, with regard to Article 29 position on data transfers and so on. We have passed a legislation which ends with this by saying you will be in the position that you will vote by majority what the EU and enforcement agencies' interpretation will be. So it's like we are creating a kind of FTC structure with our data protection authorities in this newly created board. So it's delivering for more legal certainty, for more coherence with a so-called coherent consistency mechanism. I think it's good. I think it's good for companies in particular, because they can trust that that they will be subject to one authority, but they also can know that this authority is then enforcing the view of all the authorities in Europe together. So, and on the sanctions, we have orientated with the US model. I mean, Julie Brill often says, let's put together US enforcement and EU privacy protection. That's what we did with the regulation.
Okay. Other questions? Yes. Over here.
Nate Tibbetts from Qualcomm. It's a question. You referred to standards earlier and 5G. Can you talk about the international pressures that you see in the standards fight and how, what Europe's view is on how these standards may come together to deliver us 5G in a timely way?
You know, I can remember as we started the GSM standard within European Parliament together with Mr. Bangemann, who was the commissioner, and he asks 10 leading CEOs of this world who were in the production of the equipment to come together and had a kind of meeting where they decided to sit one full night to come to a conclusion. And they came to the conclusion of establishing the GSM system. And it was industry-driven, it was backed up from the political side, and of course, and then it has to go through all the institutions which are necessary to do so. So I think what we should concentrate on, and that what we try to do with the Horizon 2020 program, with the research and science program, to make it possible that industry comes together and looks which standards are the most efficient one to get the worldwide coverage of 5G. So as you know, there is still a lot of possibilities in the definition, but the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, has to come up with a proposal which could work properly, so that at the next big international conference, we really can set the standards, because it's necessary for the global rollout. And if you see that South Korea, Japan, United States, China, at least we have the same interest to get the standards. So how earlier we start to look in which frequency band, what's necessary, which maybe soft SIM is necessary. So it's a lot of decisions which are around this rollout of a global standard. But how earlier we do, how easier it is to get. That's the reason why we are now going to Silicon Valley to speak with the like-minded people, to hear and to listen how far we can go and where we could get a good compromise for this, I think, utmost important standard to get the big data done in a coherent way also for private people.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Melissa Blowski, and I'm with Ally for Startups, and my colleague in Brussels has worked with many of you. Thank you so much for being so responsive and willing to communicate with us.
Sorry. As I work with and for startups and I represent smaller startups, many of the conversations around a lot of this work, the GDPR and the Privacy Shield, will have a huge impact on these smaller startups. And most people don't talk about it enough, but the EU has an incredible and thriving startup ecosystem. And there are several places where there are hundreds of startups that are growing every day. And I'm wondering if, specifically with the GDPR, but of course this will apply as well to Privacy Shield, are there going to be special steps taken to, I don't know, provide extra accommodations to startups as they might be smaller and don't have an army of lawyers to help them figure out how the GDPR works, for example? Will there be a lot of inclusive discussions or workshops to help some of these smaller entrepreneurs and steps taken? I would love to hear about that from each of you.
The rapporteur says fault. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so, I mean, first of all, I very much appreciate that you're engaging in this, because we have tried to involve as many startup representatives as possible throughout the legislative process already. And sometimes it's quite hard also because it's hard to really get them, because they are not really that organized, big, and like strong as other associations. But we have some also in Europe, like smaller ones who got engaged, and we try to like meet the demands. And mostly I think that reduction of, for example, prior notification, that is the big change also in favor of especially startups to not be in the position to notify each and every new service, product, innovation to the data protection authorities, but rather have the principle of accountability implemented in this regulation is one of the most important steps forward. But what's happening now during the implementation phase, and we have this 2 years of like lapse until you need to apply the new rules. This is intended also to be the time of like education, and the European Commission is starting to do that now in the first phase, especially for smaller, medium-sized companies, to explain and to help how to implement these standards across the European market. And then in the second step, they also like do it like as public education for the consumers, for example, who also need to know about like how do they enforce their rights in the future and so on. So I hope that this will help. I cannot say completely because I'm not like working in the Commission. They tell us that they will do that. But whenever you see that there's an opportunity where we can do something as legislators, also we're happy to do that. We have a report on big data coming up where we try to also like endeavor the opportunities for further specification in this field abroad from or above from the regulation. So there will be new regulatory approaches on certain technologies and innovation. But for the moment, education and building awareness about the new structure, especially for smaller companies, that's what we try to do.
Thank you. I know you wanted to say.
Yes, you know, Commission President Barroso came up with an idea to create something like the MIT. And then we said it's not good to have a copy, we want to have something new. And the new thing which we developed was the European Institute of Technology. And the background is that we have a lot of research programs. We have now the AIDS program with approximately 80 billion euro. And how can we get the leading edge knowledge out of these programs into our education system? And I think that's a real issue. We created now a lot of platforms like the ICT platform, where the key issue is first of all to distribute the knowledge from the kindergarten to the university in the right format, and to educate people with entrepreneurial spirit to give them the right education. So we have a kind of startup platform in different disciplines where we help the young people to learn how to act as an entrepreneur, because entrepreneur has a lot of knowledge. We always say the first and most important thing is to start with self-employment. It's a big step to go into self-employment, but it's a much bigger step if you are getting the first employee, because then you get a lot of responsibility, you get additional risk, you have problems with financing. So the basket which you have to bear is quite heavy. And so our question is, how can we ease it but keep it in a nice and transparent framework?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I wanted to say that one of the things that was fascinating for me in working with the task force on our report was learning how much startup activity there is going on in Europe, that our myth, if you will, that the United States is the place of innovation and Europe is all manufacturing and older industry is not at all the reality.
Is that what you thought?
You hear that here all the time.
Christ,
Not the UK.
that just gets worse. Just as well we're over here having a chat, you know.
I no longer think that. But
We're quite modern, you know. It's kind of like we don't have horses and
We have
carts,
Wi-Fi.
we do have those too.
and
but
in Paris, you know, they don't have onions round the thing and the bicycles.
No.
You know, they see themselves as quite technological.
But I think that there are still problems. Financing is a big one. And we noted how startups from Europe got to 1 part of their
That's huge.
development.
That's
And
huge.
so I hope you'll find some answers when you go out to Silicon Valley and think about capital markets union and other steps that you are taking.
And I would say
to
there
move
is a
that.
concern. I mean, lawyers are doing very well at the moment out of the uncertainty. I just want to make that admission as chair, and I do want to say that, and handed it over to Jan, because as rapporteur, he, in legislating what is the biggest modernisation in data, you know, for a generation.
Yes.
We were not unaware of this. And of course, the uncertainty going from Safe Harbour to Privacy Shield is going to keep the lawyers going. And, you know, you can't afford, sorry, Bill, I know. but we're all lawyers, but, you know, and people are making money out of this. It's not a good situation, but that's not the point. The point is it was a huge modernisation of data which had to happen from 1995. This is our perspective, but we're not unaware of it, and I'm glad Jan answered it in the way that he did. We are very aware of it, and the Parliament will help if we can. Sorry to mention that.
No,
But we
I
need to
think
say
that's
that.
a great place to end, because it is about going forward and continuing to talk together to work these issues. And I think that that is where we need to be. And I want to thank you all for coming here and for sharing your views. I think, as you pointed out, bringing these delegations is important. And it's important for us to go to Brussels and other places in Europe as well, because the more we can do that, the more we will understand what the real challenges are, instead of just simply making accusations that aren't grounded.
And the weather is better, as you saw it in Brussels.
Very distressing. So, but thank you all for coming. And we will have about a 7-minute break, and then we will reconvene here in this room. So thank you all, everyone.